Looks like we've got a few early bird attendees joining, and we'll get started in a couple of minutes.
Hi, everyone. We're going to get started in about 1 more minute. Let folks get dialed in. All right, we'll go ahead and get started. Hi, everyone. Good morning or good afternoon, and welcome to Huron's first of 2 webinars. Today's webinar is going to focus on the FDA NPRM that was released a few weeks ago, and we're going to be focusing on the first one, the protection of human subjects and institutional review boards, in today's webinar. And the second webinar will be focusing on the other NPRM, which is the Institutional Review Board's Cooperative Research NPRM, and that will be taking place on November 9th. So I'd like to take an opportunity to introduce our speakers for today. My name is Maddie Williams. I'm a senior consultant with Huron. I'll be facilitating today's discussion and webinar. And we also have Tom Beckert, who's a director with Huron, and Candy Loeb, who's a manager with Huron. And they're going to be your 2 main speakers for today. So in terms of what we're going to be covering for today, we're going to be focusing on the overview of the NPRM and the harmonization that FDA is proposing with the revised common rule. We're going to provide a summary of the proposed common rule harmonization changes. Get people's first impressions. We have a series of polling questions that we'll be administering throughout the webinar, and then we'll talk about next steps and potential impacts. In terms of a few housekeeping items, we have everybody on mute. So if you do have questions that we'll be taking at the end of the webinar, please go ahead and use that Q&A button at the bottom of the screen. We will also be launching polls throughout the webinar. And so we just ask as they pop up, please go ahead and respond. We'll be sharing the responses kind of real time as we go through the webinar content. And then if you have any questions for technology related or any other questions, feel free to use the chat function as well if there's any questions that you have that are not directly related to the webinar that you would not like to be discussed in terms of the larger audience. And I think with that, I will go ahead and turn it over to Candy.
Great, thanks, Maddie. So let's take a look at how we got to the 2 FDA NPRMs. Both the FDA and HHS human research regulations were codified over 30 years ago, with key differences related to the application and oversight. As we know, HHS regulations are aimed at the protection of human subjects participating in federally funded research, while FDA regulations focus on the oversight of clinical investigations that support applications for research or marketing permits for products regulated by the FDA. HHS issued an advance notice of proposed rulemaking in 2011 to revise the Common Rule, citing that the regulations had not kept pace with the evolving human research enterprise. In 2016, the 21st Century Cures Act was signed into law and was intended to accelerate medical product development and get innovations to patients faster. A key component of the Cures Act includes the mandate from Congress to harmonize FDA and HHS regulations to modernize and avoid delays. The deadline for harmonizing the HHS and FDA regulations had passed in 2019, but the FDA has now released 2 NPRMs designed to harmonize its regulations with 45 CFR 46. My colleague Tom Becker will walk us through a deep dive of the changes proposed in the HSR NPRM, and Huron is hosting a second webinar on November 9th to discuss the Cooperative Research NPRM. At a high level, the HSR NPRM covers harmonization of informed consent requirements, including the organization and presentation of information and the addition of new basic and additional elements. The HSR NPRM also includes changes to the continuing review process. This includes the elimination of continuing reviews for certain research and revisions to record-keeping requirements. There's also a change to what is required from investigators when submitting continuing review information to external IRBs. Lastly, there are also changes to the definitions outlined at 21 CFR 50. The Cooperative Research NPRM is anticipated to align requirements for single IRB oversight with HHS regulations while still allowing for exceptions, and also addresses record-keeping requirements for studies reviewed by an external IRB. Just a reminder, Huron will be covering that NPRM on November 9th. We also wanted to remind you about the draft guidance recently released by the FDA on September 25th that elaborates on the FDA's current thinking regarding ethical considerations for clinical investigations of medical products in children. The guidance hones in on topics as scientific necessity, assessment of risk categories for interventions with and without prospect of direct benefit, component analysis, and more. Comments on this guidance are due by December 27th, and while we don't plan to discuss this guidance today, we do encourage all of you to review and comment. Another draft document issued by the FDA is the NPRM related to waivers and alterations of informed consent, which was issued back in 2018, but never moved to a final rule. The HSR NPRM also touches on waivers of informed consent, but the 2018 NPRM includes references to identifiable private information and identifiable buyer specimens that are not included in the 2022 NPRM. As we prepare for Tom's deep dive into the HSR NPRM, we wanted to highlight opportunities for harmonization that are not addressed by the recent NPRMs. First and foremost, waivers of documentation of informed consent. So in this instance, not all of the OHRP criteria for allowing waivers of documentation of consent are outlined in the recently released HSR NPRM. Notably, there is no criteria related to waiving documentation if the consent form is the only link between the subject and the research, nor is there a carve-out for waiving documentation when a study involves procedures for which consent is not normally required outside of the research context. As I noted in the previous slide, the NPRM does include some provisions for waiving consent for minimal risk research in some scenarios, but the 2022 does not include that provision. Instead, there's a reference to relying on the 2018 NPRM to make that change. Other items not addressed in the recent NPRM include broad consent and limited IRB review. The 2022 NPRM does state, however, that while limited review is excluded, the FDA is continuing to consider how to adopt other provisions from the Common Rule and further harmonize the regulations. Lastly, the FDA opted not to alter their definition of a human subject, meaning that clinical investigations involving the use of a drug or device on de-identified human specimens is still subject to FDA oversight. With that, I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Tom Becker, to walk us through an in-depth summary of the proposed changes. Tom, take it away.
Thanks, Candy. So in this next section, I'll provide an overview of some of the more impactful proposed changes in the FDA's NPRM. And Candy, if you could jump into the next slide here, I'll get started. So in the interest of time today, I'm not going to walk through each and every individual proposed edit to the regulations in the NPRM, especially since many of the changes in the NPRM are a little more editorial in nature, but I will focus in on a handful of those proposed changes that are more likely to be impactful to us in the IRB world with respect to our human research protection programs, our policies and procedures, our administrative processes, and our electronic systems. So with that in mind, I'm going to hone in on a few topics in particular. I'm going to talk through some of the proposed added or revised definitions in the NPRM. I'll provide a brief overview of some of the NPRM's proposed changes around revised informed consent document content and structure, and some newly proposed elements of informed consent as well. I'll also cover the FDA's proposal to allow for the elimination of continuing review for FDA regulated research under certain circumstances, as well as some of the associated changes in other areas of the regulations that would need to be made in order to be consistent with that change, related to record keeping requirements, as well as some necessary accompanying changes in the investigational device regulations at 21 CFR 812 for consistency with those revised continuing review requirements. As I go through some of these changes on the slides that follow, I will be providing a few excerpts of the proposed regulatory changes. And to make it a little bit easier to compare and contrast the old regulatory text from the proposed new text, we'll use some color coding throughout to make those changes more clear, as indicated in this box at the bottom of this slide. So sort of like a track changes format in Microsoft Word, with green text indicating any proposed newly added text, any red text indicating proposed deletions from the prior rule, and any gray text that I show in any of these excerpts indicating any text that's been moved from one location to another. So Ken, if you could jump to the next slide, I'll continue on here. And first I'll talk about the NPRM's proposal to either add or modify a few definitions within the FDA regulations, both at Part 50 and Part 56. So there is one important revision to the existing definitions in the FDA regulations to point out, and that's the FDA's proposal to revise its current definition of legally authorized representatives. As you can see in this slide and in the green added text, the FDA is adding a clarifying sentence here to this definition of legally authorized representatives to better account for situations where there maybe is no applicable state or local law that clearly identifies what individuals can consent on behalf of a prospective subject to their participation in research. So in this revised definition, the FDA proposes to clarify that where applicable laws are not available, individuals recognized by institutional policy as acceptable can be utilized. This is a particularly relevant addition in light of the fact that many states don't have specific laws on the books to specify who can consent on behalf of another individual for research purposes. There may be laws on the books around who can consent for medical treatment purposes, but often research purposes are not sufficiently covered. And this proposed change essentially recognizes something that many institutions have had to do anyway as a result, which is to account for that lack of specific applicable state or local laws by defining for themselves within their own policies and procedures who can serve in a legally authorized representative capacity. So in addition to that important revised definition, there are also 4 new definitions that are proposed to be added to the FDA's regulations. They are new to the FDA, but they won't be new to many of us who are familiar with the revised common rule, because these 4 proposed new definitions are identical to definitions that were already included in the revised common rule a few years back. So the FDA NPRM proposes to add a definition of written or in writing in recognition of research and consent processes that are increasingly conducted in electronic formats. And Candy, if you could jump to the next slide, I'll cover the next 3 here as well. And the NPRM also proposes to add a definition of private information, matching the definition in the revised common rule, that private information include information about behavior that occurs in a context in which an individual can reasonably expect that no observation or recording is taking place, and information that has been provided for specific purposes by an individual, and that individual can reasonably expect will not be made public, like medical records. They propose adding a definition of identifiable private information, meaning private information for which the identity of the subject is or may readily be ascertained by the sponsor or investigator or associated with the information. And lastly, they proposed adding a definition of identifiable biospecimen, meaning a biospecimen for which the identity of the subject is or may readily be ascertained by the sponsor or investigator or associated with the biospecimen. Candy, could you jump to the next slide? So as I mentioned at the beginning of this section, we're really focusing in on specific changes within the NPRM that may be impactful to our policies and procedures, our administrative processes, or our electronic systems. So I want to pause here for a second to think about the potential impact that these changes to definitions could have on research institutions if they were implemented. And it's worth noting here that revisions to institutional policies and procedures could be needed for any institution that has previously included FDA regulatory definitions within its policies and procedures, or changes could be needed for any institution where policies and procedures include regulatory citations that would need to be updated to reflect that identical new definitions have now been included in the FDA regulations as well, or would be included if the final rule goes into effect that contains similar information to what's being proposed now in the NPRM. Candy touched on this point back in slide 8, but also worth noting here on the topic of definitions is one important definition that remains unchanged. It's the definition in the investigational device exemption regulations at 21 CFR 812, the definition of subject, which was a unique definition of subject in 812 relative to other regulatory definitions of human subject. The definition at 812 will continue according to the NPRM, to indicate any human who participates in an investigation, either as an individual on whom or on whose specimen an investigational device is used, or as a control. A subject may be in normal health or may have a medical condition or disease. So this definition has meant and will continue to mean that any a subject participating in investigation, either as an individual or on whose specimens are used, would still be treated as a human research subject. So just a reminder that would be unchanged and would be an important differentiator still in the future between FDA regulations and common rule definitions as a result if the NPRM goes into effect as proposed. So moving along from proposed changes to definitions, we'll talk about the next topic, which is the FDA's proposal to revise informed consent document content. So the general requirements for informed consent in Section 20 of Part 50 continue to describe the general requirements for investigators to obtain legally effective informed consent, to seek informed consent only under circumstances that provide the subject or their representative sufficient opportunity to discuss and consider whether to participate, and that information be given to subjects or their representatives in a language that's understandable to them. And from there, the FDA proposes to add two new general requirements in order to harmonize the FDA's general consent requirements with those of the revised common rule. So newly proposed section D, shown here, would clarify that the prospective subject or their representative must be provided with information that a reasonable person would want to have to make an informed decision about whether to participate, and be given an opportunity to discuss that information. And in the new paragraph E1 and E2 shown here, the FDA proposes to require that informed consent begin with a concise and focused presentation of the key information that is most likely to assist a prospective subject or their representative in understanding the reasons why the subject might or might not want to participate in the research, and that the information be organized and presented in a way that facilitates the subject's or their representative's comprehension. Candy, if you want to jump on to the next slide here, I'll just continuing the theme with informed consent document content. So consistent with those proposed revisions to the general requirements for informed consent, the FDA is also proposing revisions to the use of the short form written informed consent process as well. So importantly, among the various edits that are shown on this slide, you'll see a newly added sentence right in the middle, stating that when documenting informed consent via the short form, the key information required in section 20 of the general consent requirements must still be presented first to the subject or their representatives before any other information is provided. Of course, those requirements are consistent with the regulatory language from the revised common rule that took effect back in 2018 as well. So Candy, if you want to jump into the next slide, just continuing on the topic of informed consent here, I also want to highlight the FDA's proposal to add one new basic element of informed consent, as well as adding 3 additional elements of informed consent to the FDA regulations, again, consistent with the revised common rule. So first, let's look at that new basic element of informed consent the FDA has added, the requirement to include a description of how information or biospecimens may be used for future research or distributed to another investigator for future research. So it's worth noting here that although this particular basic element was added in order to harmonize with the revised common rule, this language is not identical to the revised common rule. The revised common rule language asked investigators to include one of 2 possible general statements regarding whether or how information or biospecimens would be shared for future use. But the FDA indicates in the NPRM language that they have taken a more general approach here, and they've indicated in the NPRM that this is intentional so as to provide even greater flexibility to investigators in the future on this topic. And the FDA has indicated in the NPRM their position that even though their proposed changes are not limited specifically to the 2 scenarios spelled out in the revised common rule, that the research community should be able to develop informed consent forms and processes that comply with both sets of regulations. In other words, the language, although different, should not be inconsistent at the end of the day. Next, I'll also point out 3 additional elements of informed consent that are proposed to be added to the FDA regulations as well. So the FDA has proposed to add a statement that the subject's biospecimens, even if identifiers are removed, may be used for commercial profit, and whether the subject will or won't share in that profit. proposed adding, where appropriate, a statement regarding whether clinically relevant research results, including individual research results, will be disclosed to subjects, and if so, under what conditions. And then lastly, for research involving biospecimens, whether the research will, if known, or might include whole genome sequencing. Again, those three additional elements are consistent with the revised, the language in the revised Common Rule. Next, Candy, if you want to jump into the next slide, I will continue on discussing some considerations around implementation strategy for the revised informed consent document content. Given that these proposed changes could have an impact on FDA-regulated consent documents, it does raise a question about whether there's going to be any sort of grandfather clause in place for FDA-regulated research that was approved prior to whatever future date these proposed changes would take effect. And in fact, the NPRM does provide some guidance on the implementation strategy for research initially approved prior to the proposed effective date. So according to the Federal Register, to minimize disruption to FDA-regulated studies that are ongoing when the proposed new requirements eventually become effective, the FDA would not intend to enforce compliance with the proposed provisions to require restructuring of the informed consent document or the proposed new basic or additional elements of consent, noting that there's nothing to prevent sponsors or investigators from updating consent forms for research approved before those proposed effective dates to align with these changes. Candy, if you want to jump to the next slide, we'll just talk a little bit about the potential impact that these changes could have on institutions and their informed consent documents and templates. The extent of the impact of these proposed changes, the extent that they could have, may come down to whether or not your institution has already updated informed consent templates designed to align with the revised Common Rule. The FDA has already indicated in its 2018 guidance on the impact of certain provisions of the revised Common Rule that implementing those Common Rule provisions for FDA-regulated research would be considered permissible, or at least not incompatible with FDA regulations for consent forms being used for FDA-regulated research. So many organizations may have already updated those templates, but for organizations still utilizing separate consent templates for FDA-regulated research that don't reflect those revised Common Rule changes, document revisions, as well as IRB staff and research community training and communication may be needed for this particular proposed change. Candy, if you want to jump to the next slide, I'm actually going to do just a really quick polling question for you all as well on the topic of revising informed consent document content. So let me go ahead and launch this poll and get your initial thoughts on the effect of these changes to informed consent on your particular organization. Would you expect that this is going to have a major impact on you in terms of having no consent forms having been updated to reflect these potential changes, a moderate impact, a minor impact, or no impact at all on your organization? I'll give you a few seconds here to respond. I see the responses are trickling in here, and then I'll go ahead and end the poll and share the results here in just a few seconds. Looks like the responses are slowing down, so I will go ahead and end the poll and share the results here with you all. Hopefully you can all see this. It looks like a small number of folks anticipate that this could have a major impact on their institution. A slightly larger group think this could have a moderate impact. It looks like the most popular answer, with just under half the folks who responded, anticipate that this would actually be more of a minor impact to your organization, with many people, the second most popular answer, indicating that they would expect that this change would have no impact at all. So presumably those are organizations that have already updated their templates based on the FDA's guidance. Thanks for that feedback, everybody. All right, well, we'll go ahead now, Candy, and jump into the next slide, the next topic here, which is moving on to the FDA's proposal to allow the elimination of continuing review in certain circumstances. So newly added section G within the IRB review of research section indicates that unless an IRB determines otherwise, continuing review of research is not required for research that has progressed to the point that it involves only one or both of the following, which are part of an IRB approved study. Data analysis, including identifiable private information or identifiable biospecimens, or accessing follow-up clinical data from procedures that subjects would undergo as part of clinical care. So I'm going to pause here for a second. It sounds like we've got a couple of questions coming through the chat. Maddie, I don't know if there's anything that we wanted to go back to a previous slide and talk through while we're on the topic, or before we move too far away from it.
Sure, Tom, there was a question that came in asking, how will FDA actually define key information? Will they use OHRP or SACCARP's guidance on key information, or will they create a separate guidance document at a later date?
That is a really good question. I do not recall that being specified one way or another in the NPRM language that has been published so far. And in fact, that may be a good prompt for those of us on the webinar today to be thinking about adding to our list of questions that we may want to ask of the FDA as we are thinking through any comments that we want to propose before the end of the comment period at the end of next month. And we're definitely going to talk a little bit about the end of the at the end of the webinar today about next steps for getting those comments in and where to direct them to the extent that your organization has any comments or feedback for the FDA.
Yeah, I'll just add into that, that to your point, Tom, that they don't specifically address kind of how they're defining key information in the NPRM. They use the description that's very similar to the description in the revised common rule, that it's just key information that's most likely to assist a prospective subject or LAR in understanding the reasons why one might or might not want to participate in the research. Just as an area to kind of guess is that likely FDA will want to harmonize as much as possible with OHRP and HHS. So likely they probably would not stray too far from the guidance that's already been issued in the effort of not having to have kind of multiple versions of consent forms or additional elements. But to that end, we'll have to kind of wait and see.
Thanks, Maddie.
Great.
All right. Well, I'll continue to move forward here onto the topic of continuing review. And actually, Ken, if you could jump back to the previous slide, I'll finish up just a couple of thoughts here. As you're all looking at these couple of scenarios that the FDA has laid out that for which continuing review would not be required in the future, I do want to point out that there do feel like there are some similarities here between some of this FDA language and expedited categories 8A and 8C. But I did want to highlight that the FDA has made a conscious decision to specifically avoid expedited review considerations and categories in laying out the scenarios where research could be eligible to eliminate continuing review. They indicate in the NPRM that their approach for eliminating continuing review in this way and avoiding considerations around otherwise expedited eligible research was on the grounds that the FDA still believes that continuing review for minimal risk FDA regulated research in other scenarios and other circumstances still may provide continuing to have continuing review may still provide meaningful protection. So as such, elimination of continuing review for FDA regulated research is more narrow than the revised common rule and really limited to one or both of the scenarios that are listed here. Candy, if you want to jump into the next slide, I'll just continue on with the topic here. So with the potential for elimination of continuing review in certain circumstances, there are a few other areas of the regulations that would require revisions in order to account for this. This includes changes to the FDA's record-keeping requirements for certain determinations related to the need for continuing review, as indicated in the text added here in green at the bottom of the section on IRB records. Also, in terms of the regulatory language around IRB records, the FDA has proposed some additional language related to records of continuing review activities, adding that such records include the rationale for conducting continuing review of research that otherwise would not require continuing review. So this is analogous to the revised common rule requirement that IRBs indicate their rationale for requiring continuing review of research that otherwise wouldn't require it. And Candy, if you want to jump to the next slide here, similarly, the FDA has proposed some changes in the investigational device regulations related to progress reports and sponsor reports that limit the need to create and submit such reports in cases where continuing review is not required. So essentially just some changes made there for consistency across the board. Candy, if you want to jump into the next slide here. So just thinking about the impact to us in the IRB space of the FDA's proposal to eliminate continuing review, there would, of course, be an important impact to policies and procedures, but also there could be some important changes to electronic IRB systems that are used by many institutions, especially if current systems prevent users from eliminating continuing review requirements or expiration dates for certain FDA regulated research. A few other points to clarify here for you all to think about in terms of the impact this may or may not have to your organization is additional clarity or clarifications that we may need. Including a further definition of what long-term follow-up really needs. Based on our initial review of the information that was contained in the NPRM, it stands to reason that the IRBs may need to revise their processes for defining long-term follow-up and for determining whether any remaining follow-up is limited to only accessing clinical data and ensuring that it doesn't involve any interventions such as blood draws and things like that. Another potential impact of elimination of continuing review here is just the potential to reduce the risk of IRB members mistakenly eliminating continuing review for certain FDA regulated activities, which is a bit of a potential risk for many organizations right now, where we have this disconnect under the revised common rule that certain research activities are eligible to eliminate continuing review and no such analogous equivalent, at least for certain kinds of research right now in the FDA space. So this would potentially reduce the risk for mistakenly eliminating continuing review for certain FDA regulated activities going forward. Candy, if you want to jump into the next slide here, I'm just going to be pretty brief with the next 3 slides. Well, I've covered a lot of the changes that are likely to have some practical impact to your HRPPs. Definitely not covered all the proposed changes. As I mentioned at the beginning, there are a number of editorial changes throughout. There are also a number of slightly more substantive, slightly less than, slightly more than editorial changes that have come through as well. I've indicated them in tables on the next few slides. And just wanted to make sure to highlight those as well, that the changes are more broad than the 5 areas I covered before. Just really quickly here, in the interest of time, wanted to highlight in the changes to 21 CFR 50 that there are a number of changes to increase references to the use of legally authorized representatives. There are also some increased use of references to informed consent being conducted in electronic formats. And if you want to jump to the next slide, Candy, I'll also just quickly summarize a number of slightly less impactful, but nevertheless still substantive changes in 21 CFR 56. including a number of changes that are really intended to align with the common rule, particularly changes around the language around the characteristics of I or B membership, additional references to the use of legally authorized representatives, and an additional waiver category, which I think is on the next slide, if you want to jump to the next slide here as well, an additional waiver category for use in waiving informed consent documentation under certain circumstances involving communities or cultures where signing forms is not the norm. That was a waiver category in the common rule that has now been expanded to include FDA regulated research as well. So obviously keeping my commentary pretty brief on these areas in the interest of time, but if anyone has any specific questions on any other changes in the revised common rule that I didn't hone in on in the earlier parts of this section, please add them to the Q&A as well. And Maddie, before I jump into the next section, it sounds like there was another question or two that we wanted to field here.
Yep, there was a question that came in to ask, does the NPRM mention whether ongoing studies, when this revision is implemented, and can be switched over to follow the revision in order to eliminate the continuing review requirement?
The language in the NPRM simply appears to indicate that after that date, that there would be that continuing review could be eliminated in the future. It sounds a little bit more open-ended than the language that we saw in the NPRM about there being a real formal transition from the pre-2018 rule to the 2018 rule. So certainly that's not something that's spelled out in the level of detail that we saw in the revised common rule. There is some language in the NPRM, and I do believe it was around continuing review, the elimination of continuing review, to remind individuals that for research that is subject to both HHS regulations and FDA regulations, certainly you couldn't eliminate continuing review on the FDA side if you hadn't already revised or considered that research to be covered under the 2018 rule. So just a reminder of the need for consistency on both ends there as well. I don't know if you have anything more to share there, Maddie or Candy.
I mean, I think I'll just add the only thing, and this is probably where it's going to be important for the community to provide feedback and comments. They do talk about towards, I think, the middle or end part of the NPRM around the effective date. And they talk about the implementation and kind of where they will use enforcement discretion when it comes to incorporating the additional elements of consent and the key information requirements, but they don't specifically kind of call out any of the other requirements. So if you kind of read it at face value, you could probably take that, at least of what FDA has issued in the NPRM, that when the compliance date becomes effective after the final rule, and I think it's 180 days after the final rule is issued, then institutions would be able to take those active studies that were approved prior to that date. And if you've reached those milestones at that point in time, you could actually then apply the revised regulations and then remove the continuing review requirement for those FDA regulated studies that have met those milestones at that point. But again, it's silent right now, and they don't specifically call that out. They only call out the exceptions for right now.
Thanks, Maggie.
And I think there's one more question around for continuing reviews of greater than minimalist research for FDA regulated studies. When they reach certain milestones, it sounds like that there's a question of, does what's proposed in the NPRM, does it mean that it would be best to avoid categorizing these specifically into categories 8A, B, or C when processing CRs moving forward? At this organization, they currently review continuing reviews and do it via expedited in categories 8, B, or C. FDA proposed changes don't really include any categories, which I think you touched upon, Tom. So would be interested in hearing our feedback on that.
I do think that this is going to introduce an element of complexity. It's not simply a matter of saying, you know, if this is exempt 8A or 8C, we don't have to do it. They have really tried to indicate that this is a separate animal. So I do think that there might be some broader impacts to policies, procedures, and systems to account for that. It's not going to be a a matter of indicating, these used to be different and now they're the same. There's still going to be two different approaches for some of these circumstances that may in some circumstances still fit in an expedited category, but being in an expedited category apparently does not in and of itself render something eligible to eliminate the continuing review for FDA regulated research. It's really just confirmation that one of those two considerations is true above and beyond that. And if it is true, then continuing review can be eliminated.
Yeah, I was just going to say the same things. It seems like it's going to be, if this gets promulgated into the final rule, that these will kind of be two separate and distinct decision-making processes when it comes to reaching certain milestones during the conduct of FDA regulated research. And then the IRB would have to make a decision as to, does it now meet the criteria, and does the IRB no longer want to require continuing review, or is there a reason to continue to have continuing review required, but have it be done via expedited review in under categories A or C, as an example. So that will be kind of interesting to see how that plays out. And then obviously, I think it will also potentially have an impact on the questions that we ask at continuing review, right? Because what's being proposed in terms of eliminating the requirement for continuing review is a little bit more focused, where they really hone in, and the follow-up can only be the collection of clinical data. So there is no, there doesn't seem to be any kind of room for interaction, things like that. So that could be an area too that the community wants to ask for clarification around how FDA is thinking about or defining certain aspects of those criteria.
Thanks, Maddie. So with that, we're actually going to jump into a few polling questions for you all, just to start to get some sense of your first impressions, your initial reactions to the impact that the proposed changes could have, and also how successful these changes are in meeting the FDA's stated goals. As we talked about at the beginning of the webinar, the FDA stated goal for doing all this is to harmonize the difference between the common rule and FDA regulations and reduce regulatory duplication and unnecessary delay. And as we've seen going through here, they certainly have harmonized in some areas, not all. And so just with that in mind, want to see what everyone's first impressions are here. Are these changes a major improvement over the current regulatory environment? Are they a moderate improvement? Are they a very minor improvement over the current regulatory environment? Is there no improvement at all, but at least it's not worse? Or is your first impression that these changes potentially make things worse? Responses are still coming in. I'll give everyone a few more seconds here, and then I'll end the poll and share the results. All right, we'll go ahead and end and share here. The leading answer with almost half the responses was that we believe that these proposed changes would be a moderate improvement over the current environment. Several folks indicating their thought that this was a major improvement, while the second most popular being that this is actually more of a minor improvement over our current regulatory environment. Thankfully, for those of us in the IRB world, I guess, or for most of us, only 2 out of the 91 thought that this would actually be worse than the current regulatory environment. But overall, the leading answer is that this would be a moderate improvement. Next poll, I want to just think bigger picture about the various changes that have been highlighted in the webinar so far, and think about the extent or the impact overall that the NPRM would have on your policy and procedure infrastructure if the proposed changes take effect as currently proposed. Would this be a major change to your policies and procedures, a more moderate change, a minor change, or would you not need to make any changes to your current policies and procedures as far as you know? Give everyone a few more seconds and then I'll share. You've got two answers running neck and neck. All right. Well, it looks like by a slim margin, the feedback or the consensus among the group today is that this would require minor changes to policies and procedures, with almost an equal number thinking that more moderate changes would be needed. Few people thought that major changes would be needed or that no changes would be needed. So changes look like folks are interpreting that the size of the lift here might be a little bit more modest. And in addition to policy and procedure impact, I also want to think about, for those of you using electronic systems, the potential extent of the impact to your systems that these proposed changes may have. Are you anticipating a need for a major overhaul to your electronic systems if you have them? Moderate changes, minor changes, no changes, or do you not have an electronic system, so this question is not applicable to you? All right, we'll give everyone a few more seconds and then I'll share the results here. So again, it looks like the consensus view here is that some minor changes would be needed to your electronic systems, with the second most popular answer indicating that something a little bit more than minor, that moderate changes might be needed. A number of respondents indicated that no changes would be needed, and a small handful think that major changes might be needed to their systems as well. All right, one last polling question, and then we'll move into next steps with Candy. I did want to just talk about or think about the implementation period and the NPRM's proposal that these regulations would take effect 180 days from a final rule being posted. As we're thinking about the minor or moderate changes to policies and procedures and systems, curious what people's thoughts are about the feasibility of a 180-day implementation period. Is this something that your organization could easily handle over the course of 6 months? Would it be challenging but feasible, or would it not be feasible for your organization to make the changes that would need to be made in 6 months or less? We'll give everybody a few more seconds here, and then we'll share the results here as well. Actually, looks like those are slowing down. So I will end the poll and share the results. And a clear majority here feel that 180-day period would be feasible to easily implement the necessary changes within that time frame, with about a third or a little over a third of folks thinking that it would be challenging but still doable. Only about 5% of folks who responded are concerned that this may not be feasible for your institution. So helpful perspective and helpful feedback. So thank you all for participating in the polls here. With that, I think we can go ahead and jump into the next section. Candy, I think you're going to just highlight some next steps for everybody to be thinking about as we continue to parse out and digest the information in the NPRM and prepare any responses from our organizations.
Yeah, thanks so much, Tom. Nice job covering all of that in the time allotted. That was a lot to get through. So just a few next steps to keep in mind as we prepare for the end of the comment period. So just a reminder here that comments are due, whether written or electronic, by November 28th, so in about a month. And so we do have the link available here for how you can submit comments to the feds, and the link is available here, as well as the address for how to submit written or paper submissions as well. And we did want to point out the references that we had used to cover the webinar topics today. And with that, I'm going to move it on to any outstanding questions that we may have.
We've gotten a few comments asking if we're going to be making the slides or the recording available to attendees after the webinar, and we will be sending out links to the recording to attendees And we'll be following up on the availability slides, but I think we should also be able to send out a version of those as well to attendees.
Great. Well, thanks all for your time today. We really appreciated the attendance and the interaction with all of you. Our email and phone numbers are available here in case there are any follow-ups anyone has for the three of us. But again, thanks so much for your time, and we'll see you in a couple of weeks for the Cooperative Research NPRM.